The town of Copper Falls woke up to the same dust and sun that had kissed its streets for decades. It was a Saturday, and the market buzzed with restless energy. Men haggled over cattle, tools, and half-rusted mining gear. But for Silas Ward, a quiet rancher with calloused hands and a weathered soul, the day had only one purpose: buying supplies and heading home. He had exactly $3 left in his pocket. Enough for some rope, maybe coffee if he skipped lunch. He tugged his worn hat lower over his brow, guiding his horse slowly through the crowd. His thoughts were wrapped around chores, the fencing that needed mending, and the silent land that waited for him beyond the hills. He wasn't looking for anything more. But fate rarely announces itself before it changes your life. A sudden swell in the crowd drew Silas's attention toward the old grain warehouse. Voices rang out, sharp, hungry, urgent. He knew that sound. An auction. Curious. He drifted closer. A ring of townsmen had formed. Eyes narrowed, murmurs rising like smoke. He saw shoulders jostling, boots shuffling with anticipation. Then, through the gaps, he saw her. A young Chinese girl, barely a teenager, stood atop a wooden crate. Her black hair hung in clumps over her dirt-streaked face. Her dress was nothing more than torn rags. But it was her eyes that struck Silas to the core. Wide, empty, terrified, not just of the moment, but of everything life had thrown at her. There was no defiance, only exhaustion, no hope, only silent endurance. The auctioneer, a slick-haired man with a voice like gravel and oil, was calling out prices. $2, $2.50. The bids rose, but not a single man looked at her face. They weren't buying a person. They were buying a possession. And then, a voice rang out, cold and final, $3. Silas felt the words before he heard them. But something twisted inside him. A knot of anger, of injustice, of something unspoken. Before his brain caught up, his voice cut through the air. $3.50. Silence. Heads turned, eyes locked on him. 100 expressions flashed across 100 faces: confusion, surprise, derision. Silas blinked. Had he really said that? He had no more than $3 in his pocket. The auctioneer hesitated, confused. Silas never bid on anything, let alone human beings. But greed won out. Sold. The gavel cracked like thunder. Reality hit Silas hard. He was trapped by his own conscience. Then, from beside him, a hand pressed 2 quarters into his palm. "You short, Silas?" whispered a familiar voice. Marshall Tucker. Friend since childhood. Now the town's lawman. Pay the man. Silas nodded, jaw clenched. He handed over the money. The auctioneer, barely concealing his disdain, shoved a folded paper into Silas's chest. "Got papers if you want 'em," he muttered, as if handing over a receipt for a broken plow. Silas didn't look at the bill of sale. He looked at the girl. She flinched when he stepped forward. Bruises marked her thin arms. Her small hands trembled as if the wind might carry her away. Silas knelt down slightly, keeping distance. His voice dropped soft and low. "My name's Silas," he said. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She said nothing at first, just stared. Then, in the softest whisper, "Min." Her name. Not a thing, not a purchase, a person. Silas felt something shift inside. A name gives something power. A name is where identity begins. He straightened and gently asked, "Are you hungry?" She nodded once, quick, as if she feared the offer would vanish. "There's a place across the street," he said. "Let's get you something to eat." But even as they walked, the whispers followed. In a town like Copper Falls, a Chinese girl beside a white rancher meant one thing, and none of it good. The restaurant turned them away. No food for her kind. The sting of those words carved through Silas like a dull knife. For the first time, he saw his town for what it truly was, not just dusty and forgotten, but bitter, small, and cruel. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight. He simply turned to Min and said, "We'll eat somewhere else." And with that, he chose a harder path. A path of resistance, not with fists, but with humanity, with decency. That was the moment the story changed, not just for Min, but for Silas too. He hadn't planned to become a protector, a symbol, or a rebel. But sometimes doing what's right starts with a whisper, not a shout. And sometimes, the smallest act of defiance, a few crumpled dollars, a trembling voice, an open hand, can spark something greater than you ever imagined. blank, underscore, blank. Min had barely spoken since the auction. Her small frame moved beside Silas like a shadow, silent, tentative, uncertain. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask why he'd bought her. She didn't even ask if she was safe. Because in her world, those answers were always the same: nowhere good. For terrible reasons. And never. But Silas Ward wasn't like the men she'd met before. He didn't drag her. He didn't bark orders. He didn't touch her without asking. Instead, he walked just a step ahead, checking over his shoulder every few seconds as if to say, "You still okay?" With a glance, he gestured toward the restaurant, a modest place across the street. "We'll get you some food," he said. A real meal. Min's stomach tightened. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, or was it the day before? Time blurred when fear became your only routine. Still, something about Silas's voice sounded different. Calm, steady, not just words, but a promise. As they approached the door, the restaurant owner stepped outside. It didn't take long for that promise to crack. "We don't serve her kind in here." The man spat, arms crossed like he was guarding a bank vault. "Take her somewhere else. Maybe behind Chen's laundry. That's where they belong." Min flinched. Her eyes dropped to the ground. Shame and fear tangled inside her like old ropes. She waited for Silas to walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between Min and the man. "Her money's as good as anyone's," he said quietly. "And since I'm paying, I reckon that makes it my money." The air turned heavy. The owner, Garrett, didn't budge. "Doesn't matter whose money it is. I don't serve Chinamen. Bad for business." Min shrank. She felt like she was shrinking more every minute in this town. But then, something incredible happened. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply looked the man in the eye and said, "Then we'll eat somewhere else. Not just she, we." He turned, calmly, like it was the most natural thing in the world to walk away from bigotry. Min followed, stunned. But Garrett wasn't done. "You might want to be careful, Ward," he said, voice louder now, sharp like glass. "People are already talking about what you bought at that auction. Wondering what your plans are. Don't want folks getting the wrong idea." The threat wasn't subtle. Reputation in a town like Copper Falls was everything. A whisper could ruin a man. And standing beside a Chinese girl was more than enough to ignite the worst of rumors. Silas froze, but only for a second. Then, from the side, a new voice broke the tension. "Problem here, gentlemen?" It was Marshall Tucker. His hand rested casually on his belt, near his sidearm. But it wasn't the gun that kept Garrett quiet, it was the authority in his voice. And the history in his eyes. "No problem, Marshall," Garrett muttered, "just explaining house rules." "Funny kind of rules," Tucker said. "I know a place that serves food to anyone with coin, Mrs. Henderson's. Best stew in the county." It wasn't a suggestion. Silas nodded and gestured to Min. As they walked away, she glanced back. Garrett stood stiffly, eyes narrowed, but didn't follow. The walk to the boarding house felt longer than it should have. Every step seemed to carry weight. People stared. Whispers floated on the dry summer wind. Children were pulled aside. Doors closed. Min walked close to Silas, but never touched him. She didn't need protection. She needed proof that someone, anyone, wouldn't see her as something to protect against. Mrs. Henderson opened the door. She was older, small, with silver hair tied back and flour on her apron. She looked at Min, then at Silas, and instead of hesitation, her face softened. "Poor child looks half-starved," she said. "I'll fix her something proper." Min nearly collapsed. The stew smelled like heaven. The bread was warm, but she didn't dig in. Not right away. She held the spoon like it might vanish. Then slowly, carefully, she began to eat, at first like a ritual, then like a flood breaking through a dam. Silas watched quietly, coffee cup in hand, his heart twisting. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The truth was in her shaking hands, in the careful way she swallowed every bite. Around them, other diners whispered. People pointed. Some finished their meals and left quickly. The room cooled. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed more nervous. But Min didn't stop eating. And neither did Silas move from his chair. Then, softly, her voice rose across the table. "Why you help me?" Silas looked at her. She wasn't just curious. She was afraid. Afraid the answer might be cruel. Afraid she might owe something in return. "I don't know," he said truthfully. Just seemed like the right thing to do. She studied his face. Other men, she whispered. They want different things. Bad things. Silas felt that weight settle in his chest again. That cold, hard truth, that she'd been hurt, not once, likely many times. I'm not like other men, he said. And he meant it. Not because he was a hero. Not because he was brave. But because he chose to be. Blank. Blank. The dining room of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house had never been quieter. Silas Ward sat beside Min at a small corner table, watching her finish her stew with quiet gratitude. She still ate with care, like the meal might vanish if she dared to enjoy it too much. Outside, the sky was beginning to dim, the sun casting long shadows through the windows. And outside those windows, trouble was building. People had been whispering since they walked in. The murmurs grew louder as the minutes passed. Through the glass, Silas could see them, groups of men gathering on the dusty street. Some he recognized, most he didn't, but their intent was unmistakable. They weren't here to talk. They were here to send a message. The front door burst open with a slam. 3 men strode in like they owned the world. Cord Jennings, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, powerful, arrogant, used to having his way. Beside him, his son Blake, as venomous as a rattlesnake and twice as quick to strike. And Frank Morrison, the miner who'd once bragged about running a man off his land with a shotgun. They weren't holding guns now, but the threat in their presence was louder than any bullet. Cord's eyes found Silas and narrowed. He stormed to their table, his boots thudding like a war drum. Ward, he barked. What the hell do you think you're doing? Silas didn't move. He placed his coffee cup on the saucer with deliberate calm. Eating dinner, he said. You got a problem with that? My problem, Cord sneered, is that you made every decent man in this town look like a fool, bidding on a Chinese like she's worth something. The words struck like a slap. Min froze. Her face went pale, but she didn't look away. Silas stood slowly. His chair scraped the floor behind him. Watch your mouth, Jennings, he said, his voice low and steady. Blake stepped forward, one hand on the grip of his revolver. Or what, old man? You gonna fight all of us over some yellow skin? The room tensed. Even Mrs. Henderson gasped. Silas looked around, not just at the 3 men, but at the crowd forming behind them. People he'd lived beside for years. People he'd helped during droughts and wildfires. And now they stood there, silent, watching, judging. But it didn't matter. Because courage isn't forged in comfort. It's born when doing the right thing is the hardest thing to do. I reckon, Silas said, a person's worth ain't decided by the color of their skin. Same goes for a woman. Same goes for anyone. Frank Morrison snorted. You've gone soft in the head. Ward, maybe all that time on your ranch made you forget who belongs in this town. No, Silas said, stepping forward, eyes locked on Blake. I remember every face that looked the other way at that auction. I remember who kept quiet when a child stood on a crate like cattle. Blake's hand twitched near his gun. Silas's didn't, but before the next second could explode into violence, the door creaked again. Gentlemen, said Marshal Tucker, stepping inside. His boots echoed in the silence. His badge glinted in the fading sunlight. I hope we're not about to have trouble in Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Cord turned, face red with fury. Tucker, you need to put a stop to this. Ward's brought shame on this town. That auction, what he did, it's unacceptable. Tucker's gaze shifted to Min, then back to Cord. Last I checked, the marshal said, a man's allowed to spend his money however he sees fit, so long as it's legal. Blake scoffed. Legal? What's legal about buying a Chinese girl like livestock? Tucker paused, then his voice dropped, slow and firm. That's an interesting point. I've been thinking about that auction myself. And I can't help but wonder, where exactly did those sellers get the legal right to sell a human being? Silence. It fell like snow, soft but suffocating. The implication hit hard. If the auction itself was illegal, then every man who'd placed a bid, Cord, Blake, Frank, had committed a crime. A federal one. Frank stammered. We thought? You thought, Tucker said, stepping closer, that no one would ask questions. That you could buy a girl like you'd buy a mule. His hand drifted to his sidearm. But Silas didn't do anything wrong. He didn't sell anyone. He stopped a crime. And now you're upset because he reminded this town what decency looks like. Ward's face darkened. This isn't over. Ward. No, Tucker said. It is. Because I'm making it over. You bother this man or that girl again. You'll deal with me. One by one, the men backed down. Even Blake, his fists clenched with frustration, had no choice but to follow his father out. The door slammed shut. For a few seconds, the room was still. Then Mrs. Henderson returned to clearing tables with a trembling smile. Tucker sat down across from Silas and Min. He looked tired, but calm. You got somewhere safe to take her? Silas nodded. My ranch, 10 miles out. Good, Tucker said. Get there before dark. And Silas? Yeah? You made enemies today. The kind that don't forgive easily. But you also made a stand. And in a town like Copper Falls. That's how change starts. Min looked between the two men. Then out the window at the fading light. And for the first time since the auction, she whispered a question that didn't carry fear. What happens now? Silas looked out at the hills. Home was out there. A place with no auctioneers. No stares. No whispered threats. Just open sky. Quiet work. And space enough for two people trying to heal. Now, he said softly, we start something better. Blank. Underscore. Blank. They left the boarding house just before the sun dipped below the horizon. But the light outside offered no comfort. The shadows on Copper Falls streets weren't just cast by buildings. They were cast by people. By hate. By the fear of change. Silas Ward led Min quietly through the back alley. Every footstep echoing like a warning. Behind them, whispers were turning into roars. Faces in windows. Men gathering in groups. Rage building not because of what Silas had done, but because of what he refused to do, conform. In the stable behind the house, an old wagon waited, weather-worn, patched together with iron and hope. A gift from Mrs. Henderson. Get her somewhere safe, she'd said, and with that, she became one more spark in a story that would ignite something greater than herself. Min sat in the wagon bed, clutching her knees. Her eyes darted to the door of the alley. What if they follow? She whispered. Silas didn't answer at first. He couldn't lie. The truth was, they would follow. Not because they feared for the law, but because they feared what Min represented. Freedom in the wrong hands. Humanity where they'd seen none. Dignity where they'd expected silence. He placed a steady hand on the reins. Then we'll face that, too. The wagon rolled into the street. At first, it was quiet. The old mare trotted forward with surprising strength. Her hooves steady against the dirt road. But after just a few blocks, the sound Silas had dreaded pierced the calm hooves. Fast, angry. He turned. 5 riders. Blake Jennings at the front. His face was carved from rage and recklessness. Behind him, men with guns and grim purpose. There they are, Blake shouted. Don't let them get away. Silas cracked the reins. The mare picked up speed. But she was no match for their horses. Min ducked low. Bullets whined past the wagon. One struck wood, splintering inches from Silas's shoulder. Another grazed the horse's flank. They needed to disappear. Silas yanked the reins left, guiding the wagon off the main road and onto a rough trail. Rocks jutted like teeth from the ground. The wagon bucked wildly. Min cried out as she slammed into the side. Silas bit down on panic. He didn't have the luxury of fear. The trail narrowed ahead, flanked by jagged boulders. A pass. If they made it through, the riders would be forced to slow. To file in, he pushed the mare harder. Just as they reached the bottleneck, the wagon scraped through, barely clearing the rocks. Silas stopped the horse and jumped down. He pulled his rifle from its sheath, planting himself between the rocks. Min peeked over the wagon's edge. What are you doing? She whispered. Stopping them here, he said. She looked terrified, and that terrified him, because it meant she expected the world to let her down. Again. You're free now, Silas said. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the bill of sale. That foul document that declared her property. He tore it in half. Then again. The pieces scattered into the desert wind like ash from an old fire. Min stared, mouth open. What you do? Setting you free, Silas said. Really free. But if they catch us? They won't. The first rider appeared, Blake. Rifle raised. His voice cracked through the canyon. You can't run forever. Ward, send out the girl, and we'll let you ride away. Silas didn't hesitate. Go to hell. Blake fired. The bullet chipped stone near Silas's head. Silas fired back. His shot struck the ground near Blake's horse, which reared and bucked him off. The other riders hesitated. They hadn't expected a fight. But they were regrouping, moving to flank. Then, just as the trap was about to snap shut, another sound. Hoofbeats. From behind the riders, Silas squinted through the light and saw him, Marshal Tucker, riding fast. 3 deputies close behind, guns drawn, faces carved from steel. That's far enough. Boys. Tucker's voice rang out across the rocks like a sermon. Blake's men froze. Marshal. Blake tried. We're just stopping a crime. Ward stole that girl. Funny thing. Tucker called back. Turns out that auction wasn't legal. Those folks had no right to sell her. Which makes you, Blake, and everyone who bid, criminals. Blake's face drained of color. Around him, men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't a town scuffle anymore. This was federal. I suggest you all ride back to town before I start asking how deep this hole goes. One by one, they turned away, ashamed, afraid. Blake lingered, spat on the ground. This isn't over. Ward. Yes, said Tucker, dismounting. It is. Silas stood with rifle in hand, breathing hard. Min climbed down from the wagon. She was trembling, but her chin was raised. You all right? Tucker asked gently. Silas nodded. Thanks to you, he said. Tucker gave a small smile. Nah, I just gave him something to think about. You're the one who made a stand. He turned to Min. Miss, you're free now. Truly, no one owns you, and anyone who tries, deals with me. Min didn't respond right away. Then, softly, she smiled. A real smile. Fragile, but unbroken. And that was the moment everything changed. Blank. Blank. The trail ahead was a blur of dust and desperation. Silas Ward gripped the reins, his knuckles white as the old mare strained against the weight of the wagon. Min huddled low in the back, her small form nearly swallowed by the wooden boards. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered, closer every second. They had barely escaped the town. Blake Jennings and his riders were relentless, hatred burning in their eyes like wildfire. But Silas wasn't just running to save a life. He was running to prove something deeper. That courage wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility. The wagon jolted over a rock, and Min cried out. Hold on, Silas shouted. The road forked ahead. Left led to the open prairie, faster but exposed. Right curled toward the rocky hills, dangerous terrain. But cover. He didn't hesitate. He pulled right. The wheels screamed in protest as the wagon bounced over uneven ground. Dust rose in choking clouds. Trees thinned. The hills loomed like sentinels of fate. They're gaining, Min called from the back. Silas glanced back. 5 riders. Blake was in the lead. Rifle raised, teeth clenched. He wasn't here to capture. He was here to destroy. A bullet snapped past Silas's shoulder. They were running out of time. Then, in the distance, Silas saw it, an outcropping of rocks forming a narrow passage. If they made it through, the riders would have to come single file. He urged the mare faster. The poor horse wheezed and stumbled but kept going. She had the heart of 10 stallions. The wagon squeezed between the boulders with inches to spare. Silas stopped it cold, jumped down, rifle ready. Stay low, he told Min. Blake appeared moments later, gun drawn. You can't hide in those rocks forever. Ward, he shouted, give us the girl, and we'll let you walk. No, Silas answered, you'll have to go through me. Blake smirked. That's the plan. He fired. Silas ducked behind a stone. The bullet sparked off the rock. He returned fire, not to kill, but to warn. Another rider pulled back, spooked. Still, the others inched forward. Min peeked out from the wagon. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with resolve. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Silas didn't take his eyes off the enemy. Because some things are worth fighting for, he said. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out the bill of sale, the paper that claimed Min was property. He tore it into shreds. Min gasped. Why? Because no paper defines you. He said, you're not a possession. You're a person. Free. The wind caught the pieces, scattering them like ash. Behind the rocks, Blake snarled. He reloaded. But then, another sound. Hooves. From behind the riders. Silas's heart leapt. Marshal Tucker. The marshal and 3 deputies burst onto the scene. Weapons drawn. That's far enough. Tucker roared. The riders froze. You're obstructing justice. Blake spat. Ward stole that girl. No, Tucker said. You committed a crime. That auction? Illegal. Every man who bid. Accessory to human trafficking. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. Riders turned to one another, pale and uncertain. You want to push this? Tucker continued. You'll be facing federal charges. Think hard. One by one, the men backed away. Only Blake remained. This ain't over. Ward, he shouted. Yes, Tucker said. It is. With that, Blake turned his horse and rode off. The quiet that followed was like dawn after a storm. Tucker approached, dismounted. You two all right? Silas nodded, exhausted but unbroken. Min stepped down from the wagon, her feet unsteady, but her back straight. You're safe now, Tucker said gently. And free. She looked at Silas, then at the empty trail ahead. Then, for the first time since the day began, she smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't bold, but it was real, and it was enough. Blank. Blank. The sun dipped low over the jagged hills, casting long shadows across the desert. In the narrow mountain pass where Silas Ward had stopped his wagon, time seemed to pause. Behind him, the trail was scorched with hoofprints and bullet scars, evidence of a pursuit that nearly ended in tragedy. Ahead, the rocky trail offered no escape, only silence and uncertainty. Min crouched in the wagon bed, her dark eyes locked on Silas. What now? She whispered. He didn't answer immediately. His hands trembled from the adrenaline still burning in his blood. But his heart had already decided. The time for running was over. He reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, the bill of sale from the auction. She saw it and shrank slightly. That slip of paper had claimed to own her, to define her. It was a chain made of ink and arrogance. But Silas didn't hold it as proof of ownership. He held it as a symbol of defiance. With a quiet breath, he tore it, once, twice, then again, until the paper lay in pieces in his hand. What you do? Min asked, her voice barely audible. Silas let the wind take the fragments. They scattered like ashes across the dry earth, lost to the evening breeze. Setting you free, he said simply. She stared at him. Really free? No papers, no ownership. You're not mine, you're yours. For a moment, nothing moved. Then her breath hitched, not in fear, but in disbelief. She was free, for the first time since she could remember. No one could claim her. No one could command her. She didn't know what the future held, but it would be hers. But freedom was never won without cost. From the trail ahead came the sound of more riders, closing in fast. Another group. Reinforcements. They were trapped. Blake Jennings had come around. His men were circling the pass. And Silas, despite his resolve, was outgunned and outnumbered. He raised his rifle again, positioning himself between the wagon and the trail. His stance wasn't one of desperation, it was one of purpose. Min watched him, tears in her eyes, not from fear this time, but awe. No one ever stood for me before, she whispered. You're worth standing for, Silas replied, before the next wave could strike. Another voice rose from the canyon edge. That's far enough. Boys. Silas turned. Marshal Tucker, mounted and unyielding, rode into the pass with 3 deputies. Guns drawn, eyes like flint. The riders skidded to a stop. Tucker's voice boomed. This ends now. Blake shouted back. He stole that girl. He had no right. No, you didn't. Tucker thundered. That auction was illegal. Those men had no claim to sell a human being. And that makes every man who participated, you included, a criminal. Silence fell like a hammer. Suddenly, the righteous fury in Blake's eyes turned to dread. Around him, his men shifted uncomfortably. The weight of federal law had a way of sobering even the boldest fool. Tucker spurred his horse closer. I suggest you ride back to town and forget this ever happened. Or I'll start asking questions no one wants to answer. One by one, Blake's posse backed away. And then Blake, defiant to the last, spat toward the dust. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Tucker replied, because I'm making it over. Blake turned and rode off, his shadow swallowed by the fading light. The sound of retreating hooves faded into the hush of twilight. Silas lowered his rifle. He turned to Min. She stood in the wagon, the last rays of sun painting her face with gold. Tucker dismounted and approached. You two all right? Silas nodded, breath steady now. Tucker looked at Min. Miss, you're free. No one owns you. No one can. Min looked at him, then at Silas. And finally, for the first time, she smiled, not from politeness or to hide fear, but because something inside her had begun to heal. Thank you, she whispered. Silas offered his hand to help her down. We go home now? She asked. He looked toward the horizon, where his ranch lay nestled among rolling hills. Yes, he said, with a quiet fire in his voice. We go home. Blank. Blank. In the fading light of the canyon, the desert held its breath. Silas Ward stood alone between a shattered wagon and a girl who had never known freedom. Dust clung to his boots. Blood pounded in his ears. His rifle was ready, but his strength was not in the weapon. It was in the choice he had made. To stand, to protect, to be the line that cruelty could not cross. Behind him, Min gripped the wooden slats of the wagon. Her eyes wide but no longer filled with just fear. There was something new. Something that shimmered like morning light breaking through clouds. Trust. Ahead, the riders gathered again. Blake Jennings, red-faced and snarling, rallied his men for another charge. His fury had boiled into madness. But even he could sense the shift in the air. Something was coming. Then, through the canyon's mouth, the sound of hooves rose again, steady, strong, unwavering. It was Marshal Tucker. 3 deputies rode behind him, their guns holstered but hands close. Tucker's voice broke through the tension like thunder. That's far enough. Boys. Blake's riders hesitated. Their leader didn't. You're late, Marshal. Blake spat. We're just finishing what your friend started. Tucker didn't blink. Funny thing about that auction, he said, his voice calm but sharp. Turns out it wasn't legal. Silas glanced at Tucker, then at Min. Her hand tightened on the side of the wagon. Tucker dismounted. The men who claimed to own her had no papers, no authority, which means they sold something they didn't have the right to. Which means everyone who bid, including you, Blake, committed a crime. The words fell like iron. Federal crime. Human trafficking. The riders looked at each other. Murmurs. Uneasy shifting in saddles. None of them had signed up for this. You're bluffing, Blake barked. Am I? Tucker asked, stepping closer. Want to ride into the next town and ask the circuit judge yourself? I've got witnesses. Names. You want to explain to a federal marshal why you were trying to shoot a man and kidnap a girl who was already free? Blake's snarl faltered. Now, Tucker said, his hand resting near his sidearm. I suggest you ride back to Copper Falls. And forget this ever happened. One by one, the riders turned. Fear was louder than loyalty. Soon only Blake remained, his face twisted with frustration. This ain't over, Ward, he hissed. Yes, it is, Tucker replied, stepping between Blake and Silas. Because I'm making it over. You so much as look at them again, and you'll answer to me. Blake stared at them, at Tucker, at Silas, at Min. Then he wheeled his horse around and disappeared into the shadows. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was full of relief, of courage, of something rising like dawn in the hearts of those left behind. Tucker turned to Silas. You two all right? Silas nodded, lowering his rifle. Thanks to you. Tucker gave a half smile. Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You chose to stand up. You made this town look in the mirror. He turned to Min. Her hands still trembled, but she looked him in the eye. You're safe now, he said gently. You're free. Min didn't speak. She stepped down from the wagon, stood on her own feet, and for the first time in her life, stood tall. Tucker looked to Silas. You got somewhere to take her? My ranch, Silas said. 10 miles west. Good, Tucker replied. Get her there before dark. Word will spread fast, but so will what happened here. And don't worry, any man comes looking for trouble. He'll find me first. He mounted his horse again, nodded once, and rode off with his deputies. The wind whispered through the rocks. Silas turned to Min. She looked up at him. Her voice, when it came, was a quiet thread of wonder. What happens now? He followed her gaze toward the horizon. His ranch sat waiting, open fields, stables, quiet hills, but more than that, it was a place with no locks, no chains, just the promise of a beginning. Now, Silas said softly, we go home. And as they climbed into the wagon together, it wasn't a retreat. It was a journey forward. Blank. 6 months later, the soil of Copper Falls had not changed. But something in the air had. The wind still kicked up dust, and the sun still burned over the plains, but there was a new rhythm out on the edge of town. A steadier pace, a different kind of growth. On a once lonely ranch west of the canyon, rows of green stretched across the earth like brushstrokes on a blank canvas. Where there had once been only dry grass and silence, a vibrant vegetable garden now thrived. Cabbage, carrots, beans, tomatoes, lush, alive, and utterly out of place in a place like this. But that was the point. Min knelt between the rows with her sleeves rolled up and her hands deep in the dirt. Her straw hat shaded her face, but nothing could hide the determination in her eyes. She worked with quiet purpose, planting, weeding, harvesting, transforming every inch of soil into something nourishing. And in the distance, Silas Ward stood by the porch, watching her with a mixture of pride and awe. She had come to him as a shadow, trembling and silent. Now, she stood in the sunlight, strong and rooted. Every week, she brought baskets of produce into town. The same shops that once turned her away now opened their doors. The same people who whispered behind her back now greeted her with cautious respect. And slowly, steadily, Min was becoming something no one ever expected her to be, a presence. The garden became more than a garden. It became a declaration. It said, "I belong." It said, "I have value." It said, "I survived, and I'm growing." Inside the ranch house, a framed deed hung on the wall. Half the land now belonged to Min. Silas had signed it over without ceremony. Just a quiet nod one evening as the sun dipped below the hills. "You've earned it," he'd said, "more than I ever did." At first, she didn't know what to say. But she didn't need words. She planted more seeds the next morning. And every sprout that rose from the soil was a silent testament to her gratitude and to her power. They never talked much about the day in Copper Falls. About the auction, the escape, the gunfire in the hills. Some stories didn't need retelling. They lived on in looks exchanged across the table, in the shared silence of evening porch sits, in the rhythm of rebuilding. But every so often, on warm summer nights, they would sit side by side on the old wooden porch, sipping coffee or tea, and the memory would rise like mist between them. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up?" she asked once. Silas stared at the horizon. "Every day," he said. She turned to him. "And you still think it was the right thing?" He looked at her, at the garden, the home, the peace they'd built. "I think," he said softly, "that $3 never bought something so valuable." Min smiled. It wasn't the timid smile of a girl who didn't know if she could trust. It was the smile of a woman who had reclaimed her life, one route, one step, one sunrise at a time. The bill of sale was long gone, scattered by the wind on a mountain pass. But something stronger had taken its place, a friendship forged in fire. A purpose born from pain. And a future grown from faith. And long after the people of Copper Falls forgot the details of that strange day, when a quiet rancher bought a girl for $3.50, Min and Silas remembered what truly mattered. That freedom is not given. It is fought for. That healing is not instant. It is earned, slowly, patiently. And that even in the harshest places, something beautiful can grow.